What is going on, everybody across the world? I am Lawrence Henderson, and you are here for our monthly C3, our consciousness leadership co-op that we have been founded in LinkedIn land. And so my co-host, co-creator, partner in success, Karen, is not here today, but she made sure that this panel was stacked before she departed us. And so I have Sharon Clinton here with me to co-host this amazing panel, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves. But those who have been friends of the show, friends of the family for quite some time, 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, me and Karen connected, and it was all about leaders collaborating. It was all about leaders not being in competition, but also about a up leveling as it pertains to our consciousness and how we engage not only our communities, but our worlds and the way that we did work. And one of the biggest things we knew we would pull from our community on topics that they were purposeful about, passionate about, and have these monthly banters, just providing platinum nuggets, which I know we're going to do today. And so before we get into the conversation about today, I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists and co-hosts, and then we will get into the conversation about servant leadership and serving of. And so we have Sharon Clinton here, an amazing leader who, again, said yes to the call to consciousness and is here today with us, and just making sure that I don't go too off the rails when it comes to the panel discussion. And so, Sharon, tell the people who you are, where you are in the world, and then we'll go around the horn.
Oh yeah, man. So thank you as always for an opportunity to share what we do and to welcome others into this conscious leadership space to both elevate and kind of help leaders kind of get free in the use of their voice, but also in the use of their purpose. So Sharon Clinton, 20 years plus, leadership in a number of different industries, from government to finance to nonprofit, Fortune 500. And in those experiences, even from a purpose-driven, perspective on the nonprofit and advocacy side, which I think is my truest heart, because I think my purpose is aligned through Christ first, before it is aligned through business. Yeah, that's who I am. I'm driven first by that, and we'll be talking a little bit about that today. But I'm an advocate before I'm ever a leader, and that is because I believe freedom is available for all, and we've all struggled through it. We've fallen through it. I'm in a season of flailing myself right now, so in transparency. But that is who I am, and thank you for having me today, Lawrence. Always.
My absolute pleasure. And so next we have Cynthia Pete joining us. Go ahead. I'm waiting for these platinum nuggets to drop from Cynthia. But Cynthia, let the folks know who you are, where you're from in the world, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. So my name is Cynthia Pete. I am from Dallas, Texas. I have 20 plus years in the IT background, have worked for different organizations. I've also worked in nonprofit heavily and in leadership, probably for about 15 years. So having those two worlds and those two perspectives of leadership has really served me well in how to serve in either capacity, right? Bringing the strategy to the nonprofit, bringing the grace and the service to the for-profit. So I am extremely passionate about that. I've also done real estate, starting my entrepreneurship journey in 2019 that just, I have learned so much. It has made me a better person, a better leader, and frankly, a better employee. So really excited about this topic today.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And my guy, Dave G is in the house, y'all. And so before and again, I'll spend a little time with Dave, because Dave, it helped me as a servant leader as I transitioned from the military into corporate world, corporate life, and really helping me be able to define who I was and how I was showing up. And really showed me what servant leadership was all about before it was ever even a concept that I wanted to even talk about or dig into. And so, David, tell the people who you are, where you are in the world. And then
All right. Well, I'm already getting fired up just listening to the introductions, Lawrence. So you have certainly been a great help to me too. Lawrence is one of the guys that gave me a lot of tough love, right, if you will, coming up to where I am. And I still think and process some of the things he taught me back then today. As recent as yesterday, I was talking about it. But my name is Dave Garesso. I am a Christian-based, heart-centered coach that helps people find their purpose and figure out a strategy towards fulfilling it. That is really what my mission is. But I have over 20 years of experience in the technology space within corporate America. I have actually become an advocate for Christ in that time that I was going through those 20 years. And so I've actually experienced the transition from authoritarian leadership, even practicing it to the point where today a very good friend of mine left the organization or went to a different part of the organization because he couldn't stand working for me. Then later learned what servant leadership is all about and completely turn things around. So, and yes, like Lauren said, have a great opportunity to train hundreds of people on servant leadership and team building exercises as well. So that's where I'm at today. I'm just in the early stages of the entrepreneurial journey, starting my business, Beacon Leaders, doing the coaching and training.
I love it. I love it. And those of you who are out there watching live, please let us know where you're joining or viewing us from. And I see a couple of my students from Morehouse College are joining the live. So what's going on, gentlemen? It's great to have you on live with us to have this conversation. And so there's some people out there who may have never heard of servant leadership, or they heard it in passing, or they saw it on somebody's t-shirt because it's one of those cute, popular phrases that everybody likes to sign themselves up for. But the history of servant leadership, as I know it, Robert Greenleaf is kind of the father of servant leadership, publishing his book back in the 70s. And that has morphed into, I believe, servant leadership to be a lifestyle, not just another leadership framework that people sign themselves up for. And so we'll go around the horn really quick. What is the definition of servant leadership to you all? And I'll start with Sharon.
So listen, sometimes I have to take my glasses off for this one because I feel like it has morphed into a number of different things, but the adaptation from Greenleaf, where I was first introduced to this, really was through John Maxwell, right? Mm-hmm. So from a Christian, perspective, even some of this is in, I believe, Kuznets and Posner, which is a model that's used very heavily, in facilitation and training. But the reality is, it's actions and motivations for me. That's about your own personal kind of selfless commitment to a cause, right? To an organization, to the leaders, to those in which you serve, right? So you're there for an outcome, but your first position from my current position is to serve people while you're doing it. It gives, again, way to freedom for people to show up authentic themselves while they are driving results and growth within an organization. That's my definition.
I love it. I love it. Dave, throw it in here.
Sure. So I actually was thinking about this on the ride here today. Servant leadership really has to do with it. First of all, the position of your heart, right? How do you see, first of all, yourself? How do you value yourself? But also, when we value ourselves, when we see ourselves correctly, right? And even through the lens of love, it makes it easier to do that for others. And ultimately, obviously it's in the name, servant leadership, right? To be able to serve well, we must be served well. To be able to love well, we must be loved well. You also hear things like transparency begets transparency, vulnerability begets vulnerability. It's learning to process those things first within ourselves so that we can translate outward. But also this idea of moral authority, right? The word authority is thrown around a lot. Power, authority. And that when it comes to leadership, those are the terms that I think we get hung up on a lot. But when we talk about authority and we think in terms of moral authority as being absolute, then concepts like servant leadership or conscious leadership become a lot easier to understand and process, because we're sticking to that moral authority. And the moment we breach that, that's when we start running into issues. So I think when we talk about servant leadership, we're really talking about how do we stay within the boundaries of that moral authority, and how do we deal with the breaches that happen?
Oh man, yeah, servant leadership is about position of the heart, and I saw Sharon with the poetry snaps. That one hit right high. Dave, you coming in hot. Cynthia, what is servant leadership to you?
Yeah, so servant leadership to me is, in a nutshell, I'm more invested in the who than I am the what. I'm more invested in the person than I am the purpose. And so I think when that is your focus, I am a very task oriented person. So for me, the task is going to get done easy. What I have to do is focus, make sure I don't look over the person trying to get the task done. And oftentimes, the way for me as a servant leader, I focus on creating the environment so people can grow. A lot of times in leadership, if you're not getting what you want, you got to check your environment. You have to check the environment you're creating. So simply put, I'm focused on that person over the purpose.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, and I think what you all have been talking about, again, this is, and one of the things I love to just how I describe just engaging with others is leadership is a contact sport, and it starts from the inside out. And the things that you all have been describing is really meaning that you have to have or are doing your work, actually engage in servant leadership well. And there's this concept of, kind of, is it servant leadership or is it being in service of? And I believe that other part of it is the framework of leadership. That's really that in service of, in Europe, trying to apply a framework, a process, a procedure. And Cynthia, it busts people between the eyes when you say, am I more invested in the who than the what? And I think a lot of times the way that leadership has been taught, there's been a what to it. There's been steps to it. And so when you think about just your world, Cynthia, of coming from that IT background, all the rest of those things, how do you get people out of leading through process and procedure, but leading the way that you described?
So I think what we have to do is, and it's a delicate balance in the corporate world. Entrepreneurship is a little different, but in the corporate world, it is a delicate balance, because what I focus on is we're all having a human experience. We're not machines. And so the way that you do that is, honestly, for me, I do it one by one. I think it starts with the leader, understanding who I am. But oftentimes the framework for me is I need to understand, how does this person communicate? And as a leader, I'm going to communicate how they communicate, not how I do. Because once they feel like you're actually listening to them and you're investing in them, then they begin to open up and they begin to listen to some of the things you want to say and that whole framework. So I think it begins with the leader, showing some humbleness and being very personable to their employees. It's a little different in entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is easy because you kind of make the rules. You're creating the culture. So it's much easier in that, just to kind of state your vision and let people know I'm personally invested in you. In the corporate world, you kind of have to fit it in with the overall culture of the company. And sometimes you have subcultures, within the company, as much longitude that you have to do that. Right. So I know there's in the company I work with, there's some places, I would gladly work, and others and maybe not. And that's okay, because we're not all the same. So I really think it starts with yourself. It starts with communication and humbling yourself to communicate the way the person you're talking to, and not how you like to communicate.
Ooh, you talking about platinum rule, golden rule stuff. Don't get nothing started, Cynthia. Don't get nothing started. And Dave, I know you. So me and Dave met as he was also in that IT space, but in that Scrum, in that agile space. And Dave, over the years, how has your engagement with servant leadership and other brands of leadership modality, how has that grown itself to where it's positioned you where you are today?
I mean, it definitely has. I used to view a long time ago, I used to view leadership as just impressing people to the point where they're like, "Oh, I got to have this guy." But as things evolved, I realized that it's an investment in others that ultimately leads to having maybe an influential bank account, if you will. And I don't want to stop at platinum role because I think that's critical, right? That right there, that platinum role. And if you haven't heard what that is, I'm going to tell you in a second. But that platinum rule right there is the thing that can transition you from having an off understanding to having the right understanding about what it means to be a servant leader. And the golden rule you've probably heard is treat others the way that you want to be treated. But the platinum rule is so much bigger. And I think Robert had made a comment about how they communicate is big. And it's true. How we communicate, how others that we serve communicate, this matters. So the platinum rule is to treat others the way that they want to be treated. This also means when it comes to communication, like Cynthia's talking about, how others like to receive communication is critical. Do we spend the time learning other forms of communication so that we're able to communicate well with them the way they want to receive it? Not just with communication, but what other needs do they have? What are the, simple things like struggles? Sometimes we look at a struggle that a person may be having and we prejudge that struggle and we immediately make up a strategy in our own mind before we even take the time to listen and hear them out. And now we're getting frustrated and we're making plans for their exit before we even gave a chance for the relationship to develop. So we've got to focus on that platinum rule. We got to focus on what it is that their needs are. And that's the thing that I developed over the years, Lawrence, is learning to slow down and do that, to do more of using these than this right here. That's the critical part. So that's my part of it for now.
I love it. And Sharon, when you think about just your connection to the world of conscious leadership and understanding with this idea of servant leadership and practice, like how have you supported leaders building out their dexterity of doing this well?
So I think I like to always start with a little bit in the middle of what Cynthia and Dave are articulating. And for me, it's the balance between what you're focusing on and what you're willing to be flexible on, right? So it's a little bit of, you got to listen, you got to take some time, 3 T's, time, trust, transparency. If you don't have one or the other, it just doesn't work depending upon who you're attempting to relate to. And because often I find that we as leaders have knowledge, sometimes the knowledge goes forth first, right? So I have this knowledge of servant leadership in my mind. It is not always welcomed, right? So there's this balance between the focus of introduction of what servant leadership is, an acknowledgement that people may or may not understand it, hence the in service of, like, what am I attempting to serve in my role, when servant leadership is causing, again, for inward and then outward reflection and execution. But how do you stop and say, I'm going to focus on this because maybe this person is struggling in a particular area, like David said. I have had to literally be quiet and kind of dance around, right? Conversation. And people are like, why don't you just get to the point of what you're saying? Because I can be a D in my communication style, I have to turn it off for a second because knowledge is attempting to go before the person, right? And I'm saying this person is not going to receive this well. I haven't invested enough time. So with that being said, I think where I like to start with and articulate is the balance between focus and flexibility. And I like to ask questions, right? It's a difference between imparting knowledge and where knowledge is on fertile ground, right? Like, do I have your permission to speak to what you've come to me on first before I get into some of these things? We don't always ask for permission to lead other leaders or lead in spaces, or I have the knowledge, here's the work, do this thing. That's why servant leadership for me is so important, because I'm understanding that my knowledge set is not all knowledge set, and all other knowledge is also applicable. I'll stop there.
No, that is you, boy. Y'all better stop playing with me, because what you're focusing on and balancing that with what you're willing to be flexible on, it really speaks to, again, people that make it about themselves, right? I could pontificate all day long. Servant leadership briefs well. Everybody should participate in it. Everybody should sign themselves up for it if you want to influence in corporate spaces, in entrepreneur spaces. And I would say, Cynthia, on the entrepreneurship side, you have to balance that point you made is we're all dealing with human beings. On the entrepreneur side, it's not just about making a buck, but understanding there are people on the other side of this thing that you want to say yes to you. And there's even more nuance to be in service from a servant leadership perspective, and not just be in service of, because I know as an entrepreneur, 3 years into this game full time, I know I had to punch myself a couple times, like, dude, who are the people you're intending to support, and not just what they can do for you via a check or an invoice. And so I really say to all of you, how do you get people to be more curious about where they are in their journey to become true servant leaders? I'll let anybody jump out there. That's free for all.
Open-ended questions.
All the time.
It's such a big one. And I just throw it out there, like, I'll just ask people at random, like, is this what you always dreamed of? And they're always a little off put by that. Like, why are you even asking? But it gives them the opportunity to answer it, right? And make sure that you stipulate money's not an issue, time's not an issue. All these, because we automatically start standing up barriers the moment somebody asks us a question like that, because we have to find the how. We got to know how. And if we can't see that in our mind's eye right away, we're automatically shutting it down. But to have that that desire to dream again, like we once did as children, we have to be given the permission. Essentially, we have to give ourselves the permission to be able to go inside and dream without all the limitations. Right. So asking those open-ended questions, giving them the opportunity to answer and process, and continuing with the questions that take it deeper. Okay, you always wanted to do this. What was it about that you loved? What is it that excites you about that? How did you get to the point where you actually started dreaming that? If it takes them back, right, to where they once were, because it was in us at one point, all of us had it. If we can go back to that and pull that back out and put it front and center, suddenly something comes alive within us. I'm sure you've all experienced that before, where you start seeing it come back to life again. And it's like somebody gave you some coffee or something, but you never drank coffee. You just feel this excitement rising. That's the beginning. That's where the flower sort of starts to bloom, and we can work on that, right? So that's
David, this is so good. So I'm gonna have to depart to serve another leader here shortly, and so I kind of want to throw this in, but as an extension of what David is saying, I think you're spot on. Number one, in asking those questions and giving people permission to be right, their most authentic selves at all times, where failure is not an option but a seed to success. So whoever you feel like you were born to be in this moment, regardless of role, regardless of what you're doing, kind of doesn't matter when you're attempting to collaborate. And it sounds like what David is saying. And as you are asking those questions, you're also kind of laying yourself bare at the same time. Oh, you had this dream? I had this kind of dream. And here's what it is. But when I'm at the table to try to build collaborative tables, hey, we're in a unique situation in the world, right? So I like to do something about like what I call clearing the path, right? I'm an African-American woman, right? I just call it out in the room. Hey, I'm Black, 365 days, just turned 50 in September. So now that we've established that, right? To my allies, to my non-allies in the room, right? Let's go to work. this is no longer a barrier to our success for the moment. So if you've considered it being that, if we're going to talk about DEI, right? I'm Black. Okay. Right? Here's my, you know, sort of pink hands, right? I'm waving a white flag. Take it off the table. And whatever it is, whatever you perceive your baggage to be, whatever you perceive, whatever, I am here to serve you too, because the goal is the work, right? And the work gets done through people. So I clear the path. I try to erase the barriers that diminish other humans and their lived experience, which is what Cynthia was kind of articulating, because I'm no judge of that. Right? You gotta judge in a jury elsewhere, but it's not in the room when we're trying to get good work done. It's not there for me. So
I love that, and I like the fact that you tried to be you were Eminem in 8 Mile. You be Rabbit. I'm gonna take the jokes off the table before anybody tries to make jokes. I'm gonna put it out there. I am who I am, and okay, now that that's out the way, let's go to work. And I think that is when it comes to this being authentic as a practice, as a lifestyle. Sharon, I think that's the biggest part of it, is because the minutia of so much stuff is always in the table with everything else, that the work gets lost because it's trying to weave it into everything else, when it should just be about the life that we live together, right? Doing this work. But it's because nobody puts those things on the table explicitly that implicitly and unconsciously we don't even talk about how it's impacting us, because it hasn't been a topic. And I would say, Cynthia, to pull you into this part as well, is how, when you talk about industries and you talk about just the corporate mindset of culture and the subcultures, how do they play a role in servant leadership being done right, wrong, and different?
Right. So I'm a little passionate about this one, because in this season, where my answer is coming from, with the great resignation and everybody changing jobs, what I have seen is leadership hiring people to fix a problem that really needs to be answered at the leadership level. And so what happens is, this is how these cultures and subcultures come about. The first thing, I know we're in servant leadership to the, to the employees and your subordinates, but the first thing you have to do as a leader is, we are in the 21st century, and some of the things I have experienced recently, I'm like, we need leadership to make a decision about this. So, definitely we need the leaders to decide what the culture is and to make decisions and processes that then can be cascaded down to their employees to be able to do the work clearly. I see miscommunication, and so but I also want to say, with servant leadership, one of the things I learned this in nonprofits, is leadership doesn't just go down, it goes up. So you can lead either way, right? And so a lot of times I try to create, a culture within my team of openness. We're learning along the way, because people have dropped off and we're picking people up, and you're taking on projects that were started by somebody else. And so definitely I lead down with the people on my team, but I also lead up with, telling the VPs and other people on our team, like, we need a little more structure, and just being honest with them. And I think now in the 21st century, companies will listen to their subordinates more than when I first started 20 years ago. It was kind of command and control back then. Now, it's a little more collaborative. So I think, leadership taking on the job of really making those decisions at the top, helps us under, wherever you serve under you, to really create that culture and really have a cascading top down vision. So then you can then manage your teams accordingly. So you're not tripping over tasks and miscommunications and things that really should be default and defined and explained already.
Yeah. And I think what you hit on there is, Cynthia, is I read this article. It was an HBR article,
Mm,
and it was called "Leader as Coach." And
mm,
inside of this article, and I tell everybody about this HBR article, and it really speaks to the leader positioning themselves basically in a position what we've been talking about. They no longer are the experts,
mhm,
and so they're relying on the people to actually be for them what we hired them to be for us. But
mhm,
what they were finding in the research inside this article is the clash. For so many years, leaders have been told, hey, you need to be no do for everybody. That now to remove themselves and now be vulnerable in some, like it's vulnerable to now have to ask a direct report. So, hey, how are you experiencing the changes
mhm,
that are happening? Well, they're the perfect person to ask that question to because you're not them. And so
mhm.
being in servant leadership was so ahead of its time. It was so ahead of its
Oh,
time. And now that we're asking leaders within organizations to put this into operational practice, it's actually what we're experiencing is them actually cringing because there's a realization that they actually don't have a skill set, or in some of them,
mhm,
not even putting themselves in position to even build out that dexterity and have it and create a growth strategy around it. And so
mhm,
that's why people like you, Dave, and Sharon are so important to build that dexterity. And so, Dave, how do you get a leader? How do you get an organization to say yes, two-parter, say yes to understanding where we're not, but yes to sign themselves up for the journey?
mm,
Okay. Well, that's a big question. How do we get a leader to say yes to where we're not? Um,
mm,
this comes back to coaching, right? And I do, as you guys were just talking, I think this is what Cynthia was trying to say earlier, that we struggle in corporate America because of the expectations that are different, right? In entrepreneurship, you kind of have that full freedom.
mhm,
But the leader is dealing today, and I know it's evolving, like you said, I think that's true. The leader is evolving, but the pressure is still there
yeah,
to complete a task, complete a mission, and you may or may not agree with the mission. It's not necessarily morally wrong.
mhm,
You're kind of thinking to yourself, I feel like the vision, the strategy should be going this direction, and instead I feel like we're going this direction. But your job, your finances, everything is hanging in the balance on that. So you have to look at
mhm,
you're now looking at that yourself as the leader, going, wow, well, like I'm not sure how I'm supposed to navigate this thing. So being faced with those the tough questions, I guess, of how do I take this difficult circumstance and move in the right direction?
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it takes a team, it takes different perspectives, maybe. It's tough though. I'll be honest.
mhm.
I don't have all the answers on moving that thing forward. But what was the second part of your question, Lawrence?
How do you get them to say yes to putting themselves on the path to understanding?
Vision, right?
Mhm,
Vision, foresight, is like that's one of the principles of servant leadership, right? Conceptualization is another one. Being able to look ahead at the benefits of moving in that direction and creating a clear vision of what that looks like, right? Now,
mhm,
again, you still run into the issues, and I'm sure of it. Cynthia might have more to add on this, but
mhm,
in business, right, there are sometimes tough decisions that need to be made
mhm,
that don't align with what our passion, our heart's desire are.
yeah,
But it's really taking the best of the vision that you have for the direction we need to go and making sure that that's clearly communicated to the leaders and then to everybody else in the organization as a whole so that everybody's at least on the same page. I think once we're on the same page and we begin to invest in people and remind them that, hey, you're an integral part of the team, we're
mhm,
able to then at least move forward, right? And then you get into different things like who are the people that are early and excited to jump in, who are the ones that are next behind them, right? We're looking for those cheerleaders to really advance the thing forward and start getting a foothold so that the
mhm,
momentum builds.
Hmm.
definitely.
Yeah, Dave, what you speak to there, and I love and again, every time somebody explains, describes what you describe, I think about the Rogers bell curve of adoption. Right, you got the innovators, then you got the early adopters and the late adopters, but then you got those laggards, who are bringing up the caboose. And one of the things that I literally had a leader conversation with is on the path to growth, there being an understanding that people are going to run at their own pace, and not to get to a position where an organization is dragging people over the line, because that in and of itself can cause some of that friction. But servant leadership, I believe there needs to be a buildup of operational empathy, of really, really empathizing with others so that you can bring them along. And so, Cynthia, how does empathy play a role in this?
It plays a huge role. And so I think of a company that I worked for that was excellent at this, from an operational standpoint. And what they did is every year we were implementing changes because we're trying to get better, right? But they never said you have to get it right the first time. They always gave the employee, the department, that organization, they gave us time to acclimate and to get it right. And sometimes it would be, by the end of this quarter, by the end of this year. And then maybe the next year it was on your goals. So if you didn't get it, if you didn't do it the next year, then you would get docked. But having that, they did it so well, the empathy in getting tasks done and giving employees and managers the grace to get it right. So it gave everybody the chance, the innovators who were excited in the beginning and the laggers, they had a timetable. You might be lagging, but there was such a gracious period you may be lagging, you may disagree. We're going to give you time to get on board. But those laggers knew there was a time clock. And either you were going to get on board or, a lot of times maybe that's not their environment and they find somebody else and it makes room for the person who can. And so in having that empathy, I think having a timeline and being gracious with the timeline. And because I think sometimes with organizations, they want to change now. This is what we're doing now. And they knock employees as soon as it's introduced. And I think having that timetable of empathy to allow the human experience, because, sometimes we need time to process and get on board and understand from how we perceive things to really get on board. So I think having empathy is, giving people time, answering people questions. The other thing they did was when a change was being implemented, they would tell us about the change. And then we would have a meeting with either a director or our managers. So leaders come out, here's what we're doing. Here's what, even in the layoff, they were like, hey, in 6 months, we're going to have a layoff. Who does that? And they say, this is what we're doing. And then after that, you had a meeting with the director or you had a meeting with the manager where you could ask your questions. So empathy is about understanding just the human experience in totality, but also empathy is about having grace so that people can get on board and they can either decide whether they're going to join or whether they're not. So for me, having that empathy, that company really did it well by having timetables and not slapping people's hands the first time they didn't get it right.
I love that. I love that. Dave, I'll let you jump in on that.
Yes, thank you. I was going to ask for that. So ironically, right, I was just talking to my kids this morning about the grieving process and how is this relevant to this conversation? So I've heard it said once, when we ask employees in a large organization to make huge changes, two questions usually come to mind that are kind of at the root of all other questions. And that is, what's in this for me? And what do I got to give up? right? Those are kind of the two questions. What's in this for me and what do I got to give up? Well, the giving up part is a lot of times what yields a grieving process. A lot of times we think of grieving, we think of loss of a loved one, and that's certainly a grieving process, but it could be something like loss of a position or loss of your favorite chair at an office, right? Like it can be smaller stuff as well. And, you know, all those stages of grief that we hear about, denial and anger and bargaining, all that stuff happens. And interestingly, I walked my daughter through this process of something that we had an argument about yesterday, how she kind of went through that because I had to tell her no. The grace that Cynthia is talking about, that's what's required, because a lot of times we expect everyone else in the organization to be just as excited as we are about the change, but they're just not, right? They're like, this is the last thing I want. So they're going to have to grieve that. So yes, you know,
That's
to
good.
support what you're saying, you know, have grace on that grieving process because it's going to happen.
Yeah, I love and the connection point to both of you is, again, it's helping like organizations. Please, somebody out there, y'all please share this with everybody y'all know, because it's like they forget that they employed adults.
Right.
And that, and even though sometimes people act like children at work, it's okay. But for the most part, people feel things changing. People feel things coming, and that empathy, that understanding, Dave and Cynthia, what y'all were talking about is help. Like leaders need to understand people are feeling through. Don't make them feel through it alone. Like, and so don't turn a blind eye to it. Don't just be like, you know what, suck it up, buttercup, put some dirt on it. You'll be okay. No, what both of you are describing is people want to know somebody's going to be walking alongside them. It's like you said, Cynthia, people feel when a reduction in force is coming. People feel when like there's going to be a downsizing coming. Like, don't treat people like they're dumb. Like they feel it coming. But the empathy part of this is allow people the opportunity to help us solve hard things. And again, stuff that's already going on in our heads, and it helps people come to grips with that grieving process. Like, don't just bypass it. Don't glance over it. People really want to know that you're with them in this. Not it's us versus you, but are you in this with us? And I think that for a lot of organizations, just starting there and sharing throughout that humility part, that humility for me is a huge one, because again, it's and I learned this years ago working with Dave in the servant leadership crew is, again, it's not thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking of yourself less. That's what servant leadership is all about. Being open, being transparent, being that leader who can put yourself not in someone else's shoes, but put yourself in position to hold space. And I think what's happening and what we're engaging a lot of times in organizations is leaders who don't want to put themselves in a position to hold space because they don't want to be honest and vulnerable and courageous to say, I don't know. But guess what? Let's figure it out together. Like that, like to me, like that's leadership in action. Is like, look, it's hard, it's tough. Let's figure it out together. Right. And so as a final closing point, man, I want people to connect with you both, in you and your organizations, to build out your network. What would you give or tell someone as one takeaway to really start down their path of getting on board with servant leadership as a lifestyle? What's your one piece of advice tidbit that you would give people? And start with you, Cynthia.
Yeah, I'm a go back to when I started. I'm more invested in the who than the what. When you oftentimes you know this in conflict, right? And so when you're in conflict, ask yourself, are you more focused on the person or you focus on the task? So to begin that journey, definitely, there's so many books out there. Definitely read the books. But I'll just end with that, how it started. The who is more important than the what.
Love it, love it, love it. How can people find you?
So they can find me. I am Cynthia A. Pete on all platforms. So LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Cynthia A. Pete.
All right, Cynthia A. Pete. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Dave, what's your tidbit?
So I once asked a leader that I admired what the greatest attribute of a leader is, and he said self-awareness. And so the tidbit that I want to leave, and it's an extension of our empathy conversation as well. And I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, I used to use my words very cutting. Right? I had very cutting words, especially when I was frustrated or angry. I would say things that were very cutting to try to get through the argument, to maybe quote unquote win the argument. And it hurt a lot of people, especially the ones closest to me. And the reason that I did that is because when I was young, I dealt with a lot of bullies. I also had a very authoritarian style father who was always yelling and screaming. And so I received that, and it hurt me. And as a result of being hurt when I was young, I had to build a wall, an emotional wall inside my heart. Like we talked about at the beginning, servant leadership really starts with the heart. So in the heart, there's this wall saying that words are going to cut you, Dave, but you have to learn to put that, how'd you say it, Lawrence? Put some dirt on it, Buttercup. But the expectation that comes from that is that now that I've learned and trained myself to do that for years, others should be able to do the same. So bring this right back to the empathy piece, right? When you're out there and you're practicing the servant leadership principles that we're talking about here, and you find yourself running against your own wall and you're struggling, like, I'm trying to be a great leader. I'm trying to care about what their needs are, but I'm just having a hard time seeing why they don't see it. This is where we need to pause and have the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, Dave, why are you having a hard time right now? Because something somewhere back in your past is driving that inability to see. And I think that's where it has to start. We've got to ask ourselves the tough questions. And, I've heard Lawrence say it before. If you don't know how to do it, then hire a coach. Hire somebody that's going to come into your life who's willing to show you the tough love and ask the questions that nobody else will, so that you can get to the bottom of it. So increase your self-awareness, become more aware of who you are so that you can become better and better serve others.
Love it. Love it. Thank y'all both for those tidbits. And the only thing I would add there is, again, and I take a quote from my brother, and the biggest thing with servant leadership is being around a community of servant leaders. So you're always sharpening yourself. And again, if you're doing life alone, you're doing it all wrong. Right. And again, it really does take a village for us to continuously to do this right. And so those of you who are out there listening live or after the replay, this is what connecting to a consciousness leadership group of leaders looks and sounds like. And again, understand this is a lifestyle for us, that we're practitioners of this, because I tell people I drink my Kool-Aid first, and I got the scars, and I'm continuing to put my Neosporin on them and rebandage because some of the scars are deeper than others, because we're building back and we're actively practicing to get better. And so if you or your organization is looking for somebody to help support you, definitely connect with our panelists. And thanks Sharon so much for being able to jump in with us as a co-host. And of course, if you need community of practice to be in community with, definitely join the C3 group on LinkedIn. We would love to have you. And y'all, it's December. How in the world is it December? And so the year is officially almost over in 30 days. And so make these last 30 days count. Lean in and treat each other well, but connect and create community. So y'all, thank y'all again so much. Until next time, be well and consciously lead.